Friends, welcome to my channel. Before listening to this story, I will ask you to like and subscribe. It's not difficult for you, but it's nice for me, and we're starting. To truly understand what happened, you need to know about Michelle and how she grew up. Michelle Hardison grew up in Cary, Ohio, a small town in the northern part of the state. Her father, Tom, was the vice president of the First National Citizens Bank, which gave Michelle a certain status among her friends. And because Michelle was the only child in the family, and because her father was a kind but distant man, he didn't spend much time with her. And because her mother Diane was a single housewife who had a lot of free time, Michelle grew up to be a sweet but somewhat spoiled girl. When she needed riding lessons, she took them, even if her mother drove her back and forth for 2 hours twice a week. When she wanted a cell phone, she had it, although none of her classmates had it yet. And when she wanted to throw a big party in honor of her 12th birthday by inviting a clown from the circus and installing an inflatable trampoline, she got them too. Michelle was a shy girl, somewhat thin and completely unremarkable in appearance. She had a few friends, but she had never been in the middle of the school circuit. And until Matt Submissive became her boyfriend in 10th grade, she had never dated before, and she had never made love, not even kissed a guy. Matt was shy, like her, and it took them several months to get to know each other in class, sitting in different groups of children in the school cafeteria. And they worked on group projects separately too, but one day he finally plucked up the courage to sit next to her on the school bus. A couple of weeks later, Matt invited her to a movie. A few weeks after that, they often went somewhere. They dated until the end of high school, slowly moving from hesitant kisses to hotter kisses, meetings on the road. They took each other's virginity in May of their senior year, as had been the custom for years, in a cheap motel room on prom night. By the time they were released, it was taken for granted that they would get married one day. Her parents were quite happy with the idea, but advised them to wait until college graduation. They applied to the same 5 schools and agreed that they would go to the best place for both of them, which turned out to be the University of Illinois. Being in college meant the freedom and privacy to make love, which they did many times. They were both inexperienced but impatient, and their love life was full of enthusiasm and fun, albeit vanilla. Matt liked the 2 or 3 things Michelle was willing to do, even though she was a little embarrassed. None of them were so crazy about Matt lashing out at her. He had no idea what he was doing. While Michelle really couldn't shake the idea that it was dirty, her boyfriend stuck his face in there. Michelle loved Matt, but that didn't mean she ignored male attention. Although she was too shy to really flirt, she certainly learned to smile and blink her eyes a little, and let some of her fans hang around her quite innocently. As for Matt, he was insanely excited. At the same time, Matt felt good, realizing that this was the first time he had to compete for Michelle's favor. He became even more attentive, even more helpful, loving, and supportive. They had always studied together, but now he made sure to edit and correct Michelle's articles in order to double-check her sets of economic tasks. He bought her flowers for no reason, gave her a foot massage at the end of a long day. He told her how much he loved her, and she responded in kind. She really loved Matt, always had, but the balance has shifted a bit, even if they never talked about it. They were once a suitable couple in their own bubble, and no one was interested in either of them anymore. Now Michelle knew about the great male interest. She would have refused if you had asked, but she knew she had options. Perhaps partly for this reason, Matt decided to propose at the end of the summer, shortly before their freshman year. They set up camp with friends from high school in the Daniel Boone National Forest in Kentucky. A group of 30 people, several couples and several singles, made a week-long trip to the same tent camp every year in August. On the last night, when they were sitting around the campfire, drinking beer and chatting, listening to the radio, dancing a little, Matt reached out behind him, grabbed a can of Millerite and handed it to Michelle. Without paying much attention, she went to the lid and found herself looking at a small black box carefully glued to the lid of the jar. "Matt, is that—" He slid off his seat and fell to one knee in front of her. Their friends fell silent, looking at them with a wide smile. "Michelle, I've loved you since I was 15 years old. You're the only one for me, and I want to spend the rest of my life with you. Will you marry me?" She froze a little in shock, and Matt opened the box to show her the ring. Suddenly bursting into tears, she said, "Oh my God, Matt, yes! Yes, I will marry you!" They fell into each other's arms, barely hearing the chorus of cheers and laughter around them. He helped her try on the ring, and her friends gathered around, talking at the same time. 10 feet away, Matt's boyfriends were congratulating him, teasing him, slapping him on the back. "Baby, you surprised me tonight. I've been thinking about this for a while, Michelle, and I wasn't going to let you go." She kissed him. "I'm not going anywhere, but I liked the surprise, the beer can and all that. Did everyone know?" "Just Adam and Sandy. I thought about their idea to make sure it wasn't too lame, but Sandy was happy and told me it was super romantic." So I thought, what the hell? "By the way, thanks for agreeing." She gently touched his face and kissed him again. "Don't be a stupid boy. You know I'm yours." The next morning, they went for a long walk before returning to pack a tent and their supplies. They agreed that they would wait for the wedding until graduation, as they had always planned, and Michelle had an idea that made Matt very happy. "Darling, I just like the ring you chose for me. It's perfect. And I want to give it to you too. Would you wear it from me, a promise ring or something like that?" Matt smiled broadly and hugged her tightly, hugging her body to him. "I love you so much," he whispered in her ear, "and I'd be happy to wear your ring." The trouble came the following summer. They returned to Daniel Boone's for a week with the same people, but with a couple of new ones. One of them was Anthony Lothari, the older brother of one of Michelle's friends. None of them had seen him for many years, and it was immediately clear that he was a potential problem. At least that's what Matt, Michelle thought, and most of the girls thought he was handsome. Anthony was older. He was about 29 years old. He was a big and strong guy who worked for a year on a construction site in Cincinnati. He was always talking to her, teasing or winking, complimenting her and gently stroking her hand. Nothing special, and certainly nothing so explicit that Matt could ever ask him, and he was careful playing the same games with some other girls. On the 5th day of the week, Matt tripped over a log and twisted his ankle. He, Michelle, and some others planned to walk one of the 5-mile routes that day, but he had to stay, putting his ankle on a portable chair with ice. And when the group of tourists returned around 4 p.m., sweaty and cheerful, teasing each other for the smell, Michelle was nowhere to be found. Matt said, "Hey Adam, where's Michelle? Wasn't she with you?" Adam looked confused. He said, "Yes, she was for a while. Hey Sandy, do you know what happened to Michelle?" Startled, Sandy turned around, but she avoided Matt's gaze. "Yes, she is. She wanted to, see one of those little waterfalls off the trail. She should be back in a while." Matt jumped to his feet, casually putting his weight on his ankle. He grimaced and quickly sat down again. "Is she alone? Who's with her?" Sandy looked confused. She didn't say anything until Adam looked at her intently. "Well, baby?" Reluctantly, Sandy said, "I think Anthony volunteered to go with her." Silence. Matt and Adam looked at each other, but neither of them spoke. Finally, Matt said, "Okay, Sandy, thanks. I think I'll, just wait here until they get back." It's been over an hour, a brutal hour for Matt, sitting there with his leg propped up, watching everyone wash the dishes, get ready to make a fire, work on a communal dinner. And when Michelle finally returned, it didn't get any better. She entered the camp alone, and Anthony appeared behind her almost a minute later. Walking straight to Matt, she bent down and kissed him on the cheek. "Hello, dear, how's the ankle? I'm sorry you couldn't join us." Matt stared at her, noticing that she wasn't looking into his eyes. She looked sweaty and tired like the others, but also a little flushed. "I'm fine," he muttered. He didn't know what to say. He was getting an extremely strange mood from her. "Okay then," she said. "Get well. I'm going to help Sandy and the girls with dinner." She quickly squeezed his hand, then turned and disappeared into the tent. An hour later, while they were eating, Matt felt a little better. Michelle was very attentive, sitting next to Matt, smiling at him, putting one hand on his arm or shoulder. After making sure he had a cold beer and enough food, seconds ticked by. They didn't talk much, but her presence calmed him down. Until Anthony passed. He stopped for a second to smile at Matt, saying, "How are you, dude? I'm sorry I missed today. It was a good walk." And then he left, but not before taking a hard look at Michelle. A long look, full of meaning, although Matt didn't immediately understand what it was. He turned to look at Michelle and saw that she was blushing again. She turned her folding chair to face him with a worried expression on her face. She took his hands in hers. "Matt," she said softly, trying not to let anyone hear her at the campsite. "You know I adore you, don't you?" Her whole demeanor was strange, and Matt's heart suddenly started pounding. He just nodded. "I'm going to ask you for something, dear. I know it's not going to be easy, but I want you to trust me, okay? You know how much I love you. You know that we will always be together." She waited for an answer, but Matt just stared at her in silence. He was going to make her say it. "Tonight I'm going to, just once, just for tonight, I'm going to stay in Anthony's tent." "What are you going to do?" The words came out a little louder than he intended, and Matt vaguely noticed several of their friends turned to look at him and Michelle. "Shh, honey." She was terrified and confused. "Matt, well, you know this, I've never, been with anyone else and—" "Jesus Christ, Michelle!" This time Matt managed to lower his voice. "Are you out of your mind? Are we engaged, or have you forgotten about it?" There were tears in her eyes, but an expression of determination remained on her face. "Of course not, Matt. We're engaged, and I'm yours. Forever. But we're not married yet. And that's it. That's what I need to do. To try. Just once, I promise." Even though he suspected that something had happened between them that day, Matt was completely shocked. "Darling," he said slowly, trying to stay calm. "When we agreed to get married, I thought it was an oath to each other, an oath of loyalty. Are you saying that you didn't mean it?" "Of course I meant it, Matt. Let me say it again. I am yours. I'm just asking for one thing, a chance, an opportunity, experiment. I swear this will be the only time, and next summer we'll get married and you'll be my only one. Until death do us part, as in wedding vows." "Don't dwell on it, please, baby. I know how you feel, surprise, but that's okay. I will always be yours." She stared at him intently, a couple of tears running down her cheeks. He knew she meant what she said, and he idly wondered if she had suddenly gone mad. Deep breathing. Then another one. Matt said, "What if I say no?" Michelle stared at him, gripping his hands tightly. "I love you, Matt, but I'm going to do this, and tomorrow morning everything will be done, and I will be your love and partner forever." She leans forward. She hugs him and hugs him tightly, tenderly. He didn't hug her back, just put his hands on his lap. She hugged him, then let go, looking him straight in the eye. "I love you, Matt," she said again. Then she turned around and entered the tent. Feeling tears welling up in his eyes, Matt looked around. Most of their friends didn't seem to know about the confrontation, but Matt noticed that some of them tried their best to appear as if they hadn't noticed anything. He sat quietly, wiping away his tears as carefully as he could, and he continued to sit alone, on the sidelines, in shock and complete suffering. After a while, he had to take a piss, so he got up and limped painfully to the edge of the clearing and a few feet into the woods. On the way back to his place, he headed for the tent, hoping to try to reason with Michelle again, but it was empty. It was dark by this time, and she clearly took advantage of his brief absence to leave without talking to him again. To really understand what happened, you need to know about Matt and how he was raised. Matthew Pokorny and his older brother Jason grew up on a small farm near Cary. Their father, who ran a small gas station on North Vance Street in the city, was a loud and violent bully. He drank too much and pretty much terrorized his wife, a sweet little woman who was crazy about her boys. The three of them, Jason, Matt, and their mother Alice, formed a kind of bond, a necessary alliance against the powerful man who kept them in constant fear. He only occasionally hit them, but his verbal abuse was constant, and the sense of threat never diminished. When their father divorced her and moved to Tampa, it was a great relief for both boys and their mother. Matt was 14 when he left. Jason, 2 years older than Matt, was outraged and offended. He never dared to answer, but the feeling of rebellion was never far from the surface. He also became fiercely protective of Matt, who was much quieter and more timid by nature. Matt's survival mechanism was supposed to be invisible. He never protested, never argued, and tried to be around his father as little as possible. The same approach served Matt well at school, or so it seemed to him. He had one longtime friend, Danny Capello, who had known him since 2nd grade, but otherwise kept to himself. He was an above-average student, although his teachers wanted him to talk more and he avoided trouble. Sitting next to Michelle Hardison on the bus that day was definitely the bravest move he had ever made in his life, and inviting her to a movie a few weeks later was the next bravest. He absolutely couldn't believe that she had said yes, and their relationship had made him happier than ever. Jason liked her the most. Jason, his idol and protector, his role model, thought Michelle was sweet and really good to him. 4 years later, when Matt was preparing to propose, he had a long phone conversation with Jason, who by then lived and worked in Louisville, and Jason wholeheartedly supported his plan. When he and Michelle were in Illinois and her late developing body began to attract a lot of male attention to her, Matt was too observant to ignore and too thoughtful not to think how to respond. He chose a quiet approach, which was typical of his personality. Nothing confrontational, nothing direct. He stepped up his game. He tried harder than ever to show Michelle how special she was to him, how much he loved her. There was nothing insincere or cynical about it. He really loved her. But he also reacted to the changed circumstances, making sure that his strengths as a guy were never too far away from her. Michelle's happy and eager acceptance of his marriage proposal filled him with joy, and their first year together in Illinois was the best year of his life. Thus, her behavior on the campgrounds the following summer was like being hit from behind by 2x4. It wasn't that he hadn't noticed Anthony and identified him as a threat, but the guys had flirted with Michelle before, and from where Matt stood, Anthony didn't seem to have anything the others didn't have. Now, sitting alone in the dark, knowing about his aching ankle and his heart, he wondered what the hell he had missed. What exactly was there about this guy who could shit his whole life? He was going to lie down in his tent, not that he had much hope of getting any sleep that night, when Adam quietly approached him with another guy from the group, Roger Denson, a man Matt didn't know so well. Adam spoke very quietly. Matt, I'm sorry, but, well, Roger wants to tell you about what he, saw this afternoon. I'm really sorry, man. Adam squeezed Matt's shoulder and left. Roger sat down on the ground, embarrassed. Hey, Matt, listen, I wasn't going to say anything, but Adam watched you talking to Michelle earlier and, well, he said I really needed to talk to you. Feeling numb, Matt just nodded. During today's hike, I kind of fell behind by the end. Actually, well, I've been jogging and I'm sorry. This part doesn't matter. Anyway, I was way behind the others, and on the way back, I suddenly thought that I would take a side path to that waterfall. It must be so beautiful. Anyway, I partially went down the path, and then I heard a noise in the clearing, and I'm sorry, Matt, but I saw Michelle with, Anthony. They did it. He was holding her on all fours, he was behind her, and, well, I think you know the rest. I'm really sorry. They planned hiking trips for a week almost every summer. There were quite a few other young men on the trip this year who were having fun, at least until she started flirting with one of the other guys. John complained to her, she apologized and promised to stop, but the very next afternoon she disappeared. John asked around, and several people told him that they thought she had reached the waterfall. It was unclear who she went with, but John immediately noticed that the guy she was flirting with was also missing. When she returned and he bumped into her, she bluntly told him that she would sleep in another tent today. She had the decency to tell him this with tears in her eyes, but she still left by the campfire that night in front of everyone, with the wrong guy. Obviously confused, Roger stood up, put a comforting hand on Matt's shoulder for a second, and walked to his tent. Matt sat alone, almost unaware of the cold snap, perhaps for another couple of hours. One or two people quietly shouted, "Good night," and he waved his hand at them vaguely. Reflecting on Roger's story, Matt idly wondered how he could be both unsurprised and deeply shocked. It only confirmed what he had suspected since Michelle returned from the hike, and what her plans for that night clearly implied, and yet it was killing him. It tore apart his idea of who Michelle was and what they meant to her. He couldn't leave her like that to go away and use another girl any more than he could gouge out his own eyes. It was unthinkable. She was his, and he was hers. Belatedly, he realized that he was alone, and it was cold that the fire had gone out and it must be well after midnight. He sat for a few more minutes, thinking over the plans that were almost unconsciously forming in his head as he sat complaining about what Michelle was doing to him. Then he got up carefully and returned to his tent. He spent a few minutes gathering up his things. Then he picked up his cell phone and called his old friend Danny Capello. They talked for 10 minutes. When he finished, he deleted the call from the call log. Michelle was sick as she carefully made her way through the darkness back to their tent, the one she shared with Matt. Her heart ached for him. She felt guilty for what she had done, more than seemed possible. It made sense at the time. Anthony was hot. They had already made love once. She knew it didn't mean anything. It was just an affair. She liked that word throw, as if something was being thrown into the air. Frisbee, Something harmless. Certainly not something that would hurt the man she loved. And now all these arguments seemed empty, completely ridiculous. Stupid. He was probably furious, offended, and shocked. How could she ever make peace with him? Would he give her a chance? She also had pain between her legs, and not for the better. Love with Anthony gradually declined from fabulous, incredible, cosmic to funny but empty, and turned into painful and undesirable. Okay, he used her. There was no love in it, she realized that now. But he was gentle, slow, and incredibly skilled, and he shook her world. 3 phenomenal moments for what should have been at least 30 minutes of love. God, what stamina he had. That's all, he was so powerful and so gentle at the same time. But that night in the tent, he was much less caring, much less patient. He acted like it was settled, her hole was his, and he used it. Everything went well the first time, but it wasn't as good as in the clearing, and she was distracted by thoughts of poor Matt. Was he crying in the tent again? Was he sitting in an armchair, drinking beer and scolding her? Do you think how he can get back at her? Eventually, she dozed off a bit, but when she woke up and saw by Anthony's wristwatch that it was 5:45, she quietly got up, dressed and left, deciding to return to Matt before dawn and no one saw her. The tent was empty. Where was he? She fumbled around using the flashlight of her mobile phone. His wallet, shoes, and jacket were gone, but his sleeping bag and the rest of his clothes remained, as well as his car keys and his phone. She thought that maybe he had gone for an early walk or couldn't sleep, or even that he spent the night in someone else's tent, maybe with Adam, and Sandy was sleeping somewhere else. If he was sitting drunk and complaining to Adam about Michelle, the shameless cheating bride. Michelle was unhappy, offended, and very tired. She took off her shoes and pants, climbed into her sleeping bag, and after a few minutes was snoring slightly. The nightmare began when she finally woke up. Michelle heard the usual morning noises, looked at her phone, and realized that it had been 10 for a long time. She looked around and saw that Matt hadn't returned. Quickly pulling on clean clothes, she went outside and joined the other stragglers for breakfast and cleaning. She calmly asked around, but no one had seen Matt since last night. She spoke to Adam, but he just shook his head. The cold look he gave her made Michelle feel worse, and she got the same thing from Sandy and some others. Not knowing what else to do, she returned to the tent to recover. She stuffed dirty clothes into a laundry bag, pulled out a sleeping bag to air out, folded chairs for later. By noon, Michelle was worried enough to forget about her embarrassment. She went around to everyone in the group, told them that Matt seemed to have gone somewhere, and asked if they knew anything. Carol and Pete were leaving, and they promised to stop by the parking lot to see if Matt's car was still there. When they called 20 minutes later, they confirmed that she was standing there, as Matt's keys were still in the tent. Several small groups of friends were going to take a walk around one place or another, and they all promised to look for Matt. Michelle was too worried to leave the campsite, so she just sat there and worried. Sandy called, and she was serious. "Michelle, we're at Cave Run Lake. You'd better come down." "What is it? Have you found Matt?" "Just come down here, okay?" Sandy hung up. Michelle ran down the path and was there a few minutes later with her heart pounding. She found Sandy, Adam, and several other people standing on the shore of the lake. "What is this?" she shouted before she even reached them. After a few steps, she saw it. Matt's jacket was neatly folded on the ground. His sneakers are next to the jacket, and socks lay neatly on top of the jacket. His boxers, his pants, his Alini t-shirt. And at the very top, in the center of a neat stack, there is a promise ring. Her scream startled them and caused the birds to fly out of the surrounding trees. Michelle fell to her knees and began to cry. A week has passed. On that first day, everyone was looking, almost 30 people. They went around the entire perimeter of the lake looking for Matt or any evidence that he was there. Then people from the National Forest Service were called in, and they took over the search. Matt was a competent enough swimmer. He could swim across the lake if he wanted to, but it would have been in the middle of the night and it was quite cold, and he could easily have been disoriented. Or, and no one wanted to tell Michelle about it, he could enter the water without going out. After a few days, everyone had to go back to their lives, and they left the search to the forest rangers. Anthony packed up and left on the first day without saying a word to anyone. Andrea and Heather stayed for a couple of days with Michelle, who refused to leave, but in the end they had to come back too. Of course, they talked to Matt's parents and Jason in Louisville, but no one heard a word. Michelle called them on the first day, trying to hold back her sobs. After that, the Forest Service called every day. Michelle just couldn't handle it. When they finally called off the search, Jason was there. He came from Louisville and helped Michelle pack Matt's things. Before that, he sat down with her alone and forced her to tell him what happened the night his brother was last seen. Apparently, the last night of his life. It was excruciating. She cried, looked piteously at Jason as she gave him a toned-down version of her date with Anthony without an X rating. Her date with Anthony and her rejection of Matt. Surprisingly, incredibly even, he didn't scold her. He didn't scream, he didn't swear, he didn't drive away. He saw that she was in agony, beside herself with grief and guilt. He didn't quite comfort her, didn't hug her tightly, but he stayed with her and they packed up together. A tent, sleeping bags, kitchen utensils, Michelle and Matt's clothes. They drove back to Cary in their 2 cars, Jason staying behind Michelle the whole time. They agreed that she would go straight to her house. Jason asked her if she could come talk to his parents, but Michelle broke down again, desperately shook her head and begged him not to insist. I'll go to them, I promise, Jason. But please, not now. Please, you understand, I just can't right now. She was almost hysterical, begging him, and he finally just nodded. When Michelle returned home, her parents, who had been following the tragic story on the phone, silently invited her into the house and put her to bed. The next morning, they put her in the back seat of the family car and drove to visit her mom's parents in Iowa. They were gone until the end of August. Michelle's mom and dad took care of her. They couldn't be better. She was their princess, and they gave her what she needed. Her grandparents adored and pampered her, and didn't say a word the whole time. About Matt. She knew, of course, that they knew the story, but not having to talk about it was a relief. She slept a lot, and they fed her favorite food and let her go for long walks with 2 dogs. And when Labor Day came and it was time to return to Illinois, her parents took her straight to the dorm. And they went home to Cary, packed up everything she had brought home for the summer, and took them to her school. She just couldn't stand the thought of seeing anyone at home seeing Matt's friends, and her friends, and oh my God, Matt's family. Michelle almost always stayed in her room. She didn't want to see anyone, didn't want to go to any of the places she and Matt used to hang out, their favorite places in the student library or benches on campus or restaurants, and she definitely didn't want to see any of their friends and answer the inevitable terrible questions. Of course, she told her roommate Helen about it. The 2 girls were pretty close, and Helen held her while she sobbed and stumbled her way through the terrible story. What a terrible thing she had done. How sorry she was. How she could never have imagined that Matt. Helen was stunned, but she was a good friend. She listened to the whole story, and a pizza was delivered to her so they could eat in their room, and Michelle didn't have to go to the cafeteria. And later that evening, she went out and quietly passed the word about the tragedy to Michelle's friends so that no one would mistakenly greet her at school by asking about Matt. Classes started the next day, and Helen insisted that Michelle go, even went with her to the first class. That same day, on her way back to her dorm from statistics class, Michelle saw a guy 50 yards away from her, walking away from her with another guy on the sidewalk next to Davenport Hall. She almost shouted, "Matt!" and ran towards him. And then her heart stopped and she almost fell to her knees, realizing that it was just some guy who looked like Matt from a distance. She immediately ran to her room and cried for the rest of the day. The next day, Michelle was walking across the main courtyard on her way to lunch, struggling to think about macroeconomics rather than Matt, when she dropped one of her books. As she bent down to pick it up, she saw the shadow of a man standing a few feet away from her. "Hi, Michelle," he said. Straightening up, she saw Matt. She screamed and fainted. "Did you set this up?" she asked for the 3rd time. She was still trembling, hugging herself tightly. They were sitting on a bench in the sun near the Illini Union, but she was still cold. "Yes," he said again. "I'm not very proud of it now, but it hurt me more than ever before, and I wanted you to feel as bad as I did." It took her forever to think about it. She was just too shocked, so relieved, confused, and furious. Who knew that the phrase, "her head is floating," is actually real? "How did you do that?" "I called Danny Capello and asked him to pick me up at the ramp on the lakeshore. Then I dropped the call from my phone, left my stuff where you guys should have found it, and walked over to wait for him. I took the extra shorts and a t-shirt, but I was still damn cold, and I cut my bare feet a little. Danny lent me a few $100s. We went to the city and I found a Walmart and bought clothes, and then I got on a bus, went to Louisville, and stayed with my brother. I bought a cheap phone and called him and my parents so they wouldn't worry when they started getting calls. Michelle was still trying to absorb everything. So when is Jason? When he drove up to the lake and heard my story, and we packed your things, did he already know that you were alive? Yeah, that's why he didn't chop you up, but just made you tell him the story. He told me that you were very upset. Oh my God, Matt, what about all our friends? Everyone in Cary knows that I'm alive. As soon as you and your parents left, I asked the parents to make some calls so that people could spread the word. I feel kind of bad about it right now, making people suffer so much, mourn me and all that. I never intended to hurt anyone but you, and I didn't have that much time to plan it all. I just did it. I hope someone has already told your parents, but just in case, please call them tonight. I don't like the idea that they think I killed myself and that it was because of you, Michelle. They sat in silence for a while longer. He watched as she tried to make sense of it, to think it over. The first few days were pretty bad, he said. Jason was amazing, patient, and helpful. I got drunk a couple of times, scattered some things, even broke a couple of plates, and he just listened, let me talk, didn't rush me. You know, I've been planning on not going back to school for a while. Just disappear, maybe take a year off, go to the West Coast and find a job or something like that. But I realized that it didn't make any sense. Why should I put off graduating from college just because I wasn't with you anymore? And I also couldn't let people think I was dead. It wasn't fair to anyone. He stood up. I really have to go, Michelle. Are you all right? You still look terribly pale. Wait, Matt, don't go. Can I see you later? I really need to talk to you a little more, he said slowly. In a couple of days, okay? I've had more time than you to think about things, so let's give you some time and we can talk after that. She started crying again. Matt, He stopped her by gently extending his hand. Later, Michelle, we'll talk later. Is he alive? Helen screamed joyfully, hugging Michelle so tightly that she could barely breathe. My God, this is amazing. What happened to him? Did he pretend or something? What did he say? Michelle couldn't help but smile at Helen's insane joy, even in the midst of her own pain and confusion. Yes, he did it on purpose. He was really mad at me, and he decided this was a way to get me back. God, did it ever work? They talked for hours, repeating it over and over again. What she did, what he did, who knows, and above all, what will happen next. Helen said, well, he's talking to you, that's something. And he let you know that he's alive. I think he could just stay dead, go to school somewhere else or something like that. But Michelle just shook her head with tears in her eyes. He knew he couldn't let people think he was dead anymore. To all our friends at home and the people here, I don't think he came back for me at all. Helen hugged her. Okay, he said you can talk to him in a couple of days. I'm sure when he hears how terrible you felt, how sorry you were for hurting him. She paused, wanting to reassure her friend, but unable to finish the sentence. She couldn't believe herself. It was the hardest thing she'd ever done, waiting 2 more days to call him. He had an old cell phone because he picked up the phone after the 3rd ring and said, Hi, Michelle. Matt, hi, do you think we're going to talk together today? She was nervous and a little stammered in her words. We agreed to meet in her room at 5. She cleaned it like crazy, ran out, bought a bouquet of flowers and put them in a beautiful vase on her desk, changed her outfit 4 times. When Matt arrived, he came in quiet and detached. He was sitting in her chair by the window and just looking at her like, This is your show, why don't you just continue it? Of course, not hostile, just serious. And she tried, he definitely had to give it to her. She confessed to it. No excuses, no attempts to downplay what she had done. It was terrible, Matt. I didn't see it then, I don't know why, but I do now. I betrayed you in the worst possible way. I was frivolous and selfish, and cruel, even though I didn't see it at the time. It was unforgivable, wrong, heartless, and immature. What is this, Michelle? He wasn't going to make it easy. He was going to make her say it. She looked down and then back at him, desperately trying to keep her eyes on his face. Sleeping with, no, it's wrong. Making love to another guy, with Anthony. First, on the way to the waterfall in the afternoon. And then, I can hardly say it, Matt, but I did it. Then I came up to you and told you that I was going to spend the night in his tent. To make love to him a little more. To tell you this, and then just walk away and do it. He stopped her by raising his hand. He looked tired, and there were circles under his eyes. All right, Michelle, now it's my turn. He stood up and stared out the window for about a minute, then turned and looked her straight in the face. Everything you say is true, and thank you for saying it. You betrayed me in the worst possible way, in the most humiliating, even public way. And of course, I've thought about it a lot. Sometimes people do stupid things, get drunk and kill themselves in cars, or get into stupid fights, or panic during finals and try to cheat on exams, or cheat on your boyfriends or girlfriends. And I think young people are more likely to do stupid things, and we're both only 21 years old. So believe it or not, I kind of forgive you. I'm not as angry now as I was. Just really sad. I can't help but think that this has something to do with you. You may not realize it, Michelle, but I think that's what made it all possible. I wish you all the best, but we're done. I suppose you're hoping that we can find a way to resolve the situation, even after what you've done, after everything that happened. But we can't. I won't. What you did made me feel like I just don't know you at all. That the real Michelle or the new Michelle is someone completely different from the one I fell in love with back in high school. Her mouth was open and her face was in tears, but she didn't try to interrupt him. Maybe it was some kind of strange deviation that happens once in a lifetime, some kind of biochemical explosion of selfishness. Maybe nothing like this will happen again, and you will love me and be faithful to me for 60 years. But I'm not going to take any chances. He went up to her and said, I want my ring back, please.